Sounds good.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm really excited today to be welcoming my friend and colleague, Dr. Kyle Reyes, who is with UVU, and I do a lot of work with him, but he's also on our advisory board for Tech Moms, which is incredible, and have always appreciated his insights and support with Tech Moms. But also, what we're going to be focusing on today, which is really exciting, is he has launched a book called Lenses of Humanity. And so, really excited talking about that because my experience and Kyle and I have gone back and forth on our experience of becoming an author and getting published and getting our ideas and work out there. So,
Yeah.
welcome, Kyle. Really excited to have you here with us.
So excited to be here. Thanks so much for trusting me with your team and your group here and excited to just share some thoughts and also learn from you. And as I've done before, I am a huge fan of Trina and all that she's been doing, especially with Tech Moms. I'm a fan of Tech Moms and congratulations to all those out there who have graduated from the program. And if anybody's listening and you're wondering about the program, don't hesitate, sign up. It'll change your life. So thanks.
Thank you. I am really thrilled to be digging into some of these ideas because we have a lot in common, Kyle.
Yeah.
Right? Like our paths have crossed in multiple ways, both
Yeah.
in in higher education, where you're currently, your focus is there, and I see every day the impact you're making with your students, but also from your community work, and then both of our passion and interest in driving more diversity and inclusion topics,
Yeah.
and creating awareness, right? I think we've had that common passion and thread for both of us. So I'm really excited for our conversation today about the impacts both for our students and considerations that they may have, and then also from a business perspective and understanding those impacts as well. So I'm going to hit kind of both of those things.
Love
But
it.
I really want to just start with um, the creative process. So I'm gonna first ask you about where did this idea come from for lenses of humanity, and really how did you narrow down the topic, and who are you speaking to, who are you targeting
Yeah.
within the book?
No, thank you for that. Gosh, I'm going to really try to be disciplined and answer it, do the short version of that answer because as you know, that our answers to that very question as authors is it's ever evolving, right?
Mhm.
But I'll distill it down to this. I've been doing diversity and inclusion and belonging and human connection work in Utah County for over 20 years. Whether that's most of that time at Utah Valley University in the various positions I've held, but also in the community and living. And I will say, um, Trina, you know this, doing diversity work in Utah can be an interesting experience, right? An interesting navigation, especially over the past 2 decades. Um, where Lenses of Humanity was born was this idea that the more and more I got into the consulting space, the more and more I got into my own research and scholarship, the more I got into the speaking circuit on these very topics, right? Organizational diversity, the value of equity and inclusion work, the value of belonging work. Um, the more I realize that it, there's such a wide range of ways to approach these topics. And as I've gone nationally and I've asked people, why did you bring me in? I'm just curious. Like you could have brought in anybody else and,
Right.
in New York or Chicago or some of these other places where there's a kind of a hotbed of diversity and you're bringing somebody out from Orem, Utah. Like what? Why? And they said, well, we saw you speak at this, or we saw a friend of ours told us that it was the first time they entered a diversity training workshop space where they didn't feel like negative energy. They didn't feel this energy of just deep conflict and guilt, that they felt the desire to actually learn more and they felt challenged and they couldn't stop thinking about the concepts, but then they wanted to learn more. And they said that just is not the norm. So that really stoked the fire to say, maybe maybe we're on to some things here. Then interacting with good colleagues like you and others who
Mhm.
were also approaching this in a much more bridge building way, I
Yeah.
started to realize, okay, there is a space for a third way of doing this. And what I mean by that is there are some extreme sides of wanting to to do diversity workshops and trainings and stuff, and oftentimes people throw up walls. They just shut down. They don't want to listen. They don't want to
Yeah.
engage. And then there's the softer side of like, well, everything is great and difference is awesome and colors are wonderful and but it doesn't challenge enough. It's just
Right.
kind of the soft introductory side. And I feel like you and I and others are entering into that space of saying, no, 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 we really have to tackle the issues. Let's not ignore them.
Right.
But there's a better way to do this, and there's a way to invite people in. And the framework of the lenses came from my own experiences of literally my eyes. I was having my eyes checked and going to the optometrist and then later on going back and getting another prescription and then later on getting LASIK. And this concept of our lenses ever shifting, they're always moving and changing. And when I started to layer that on top of this diversity work, I thought to myself, gosh, every time we experience something, every time we experience engagement with difference,
Mhm.
whether it's 45-year-old Kyle or 35-year-old Kyle or 15-year-old Kyle, we're going to interpret that experience in such different ways, but
Mhm.
we're the same person. So why? And this idea that, oh my goodness, you don't ever arrive at this complete understanding of difference. This is a journey.
Yeah.
Then if this is a journey, then lens development can be a journey. And by the way, I didn't want this to be lenses of diversity, lenses of inclusion. I think those are the terms we know are so polarizing right now in this
Yeah.
political climate.
Yeah.
I landed on humanity because at the end of the day, when people would ask me, why do you stay in this work, especially in Utah County? Like, why do you stay doing this?
Yeah.
My core always came back to because I actually love humans. I love connecting. I love
People. Right.
people,
Right.
right? And then
People.
they said, well, why don't you say that? Why don't you just call it like humanity work instead of diversity work? And I
I
said,
agree.
well, you're
Yeah.
you're right. And so that's the short form of where this was born and really what motivated me to say, I feel like there's something to say there to the world. I don't know who's going to read it. I don't know who's going to care, but at least I feel good about putting out into the
Getting
world.
it out. Yeah.
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 So,
And I love the lenses. I use that a lot. Like, let's put on a different lens. Like, let's look at this from a different perspective. Let's just kind of step out of our current thinking for a moment
yeah.
and just put on a different lens and a different perspective for a moment and just it's kind of in that emotional intelligence work of
Yep.
like stepping into somebody else's shoes for a moment, kind of put the power of the pause and just kind of step back and let's look at this from a different light, right? Which is really powerful. I think
Agreed.
combining, I think the two words that always come up for me is the experience is a key word, and then that emotional side and tying those two things together. Because, like you were saying, the challenge here is that emotional disruption is really hard for people.
Yeah.
Like feeling like I'm going to be attacked, and they pull away, and you see these walls go up, which prohibits any form of growth. And what do they say in leadership, right? You've got to get comfortable or get
Yeah.
uncomfortable for growth,
Yeah.
but yet not in this work. Like that's just too uncomfortable, right?
Right.
Like you don't
Right.
want to do that. So I love your approach because you're stepping out of that and saying, hey, let's forget all the emotional, like I'm going to be too challenged, and say, let's just open our eyes a little bit and let's just have these discussions. So I would love to hear like as your experiences, right, that you've taken from all of your work in this space. And what were some maybe key stories or themes that you put in that you felt like really kind of pushed or challenged people to have those differences in thinking and applying that?
Yeah. Thank you. My own evolution in this work, I mean, just to set the frame and then I can respond.
Yeah.
The book covers four lenses of humanity. And so that's the whole framework of this. And so let me just quickly just articulate those
Great.
because
Yes.
then I can respond to your question with some context. The four lenses of humanity that I'm inviting people and readers to say, hey, I could work on these all the time, these four. The first being the inner lens. I'm looking inward, my own biases, assumptions, privileges, my own worldview, unpack that. Because I think that self-awareness piece, like you just said,
Yeah.
that is so critical. If we're going to show up for the world differently with more humanity, we have to know what we're bringing to the table, right? So that inner lens is number one. Number two is what I call the context lens, and that is the fisheye panorama snapshot lens. That's if I'm going to authentically connect with people, especially people across lines of difference, different identities, worldviews, I really need to educate myself and engage in getting greater context of the world around me, engaging with conversations, podcasts, books, experiences, exposure, engagement, all that stuff with difference, because that's going to give me a broader understanding of and a broader contextual view. The third lens being the empathy lens. This is the interpersonal one-on-one, humanizing our communication with individuals. And then the fourth lens being the community lens. And that is how are we deliberately showing up for the communities we care about? And so, with that as the framework, some of the lessons I've learned along the way, and really a lot of this, I mean, somebody asked me the other day, is this autobiographical at all? Like, do you build in, are we going to get to know Kyle better by reading this book? And I'm like, oh my gosh, it's almost too autobiographical
Yeah.
because I really want to model the vulnerability by putting it out there that this is a journey. I'm not an expert in your experiences and your lenses,
Yeah.
but I'm going to share my own journey so that, and to give license and liberty to say, hey, no matter where you're at, you can always be working on one of these four lenses,
Yeah.
and I'm working on them, right? And so I bring in a lot of, I start every chapter with my own personal experience of that particular lens development. And then some key moments have been in my role as, Chief Diversity Officer at Utah Valley University. That was a key time because this was one where my position literally was to promote this work, but then
Yeah.
I kept running into wall after wall after wall.
Mhm.
And then I would be brought in as the speaker, the diversity speaker, and I could just see people's body language right out of the gate, like, okay, here we
Yeah.
go. You
Just,
know, oh, and I'm sure you've experienced that, Trina, right? Where they're like, oh, great, here we go again.
yeah.
And we're going to check the box of the workshop, and we have our annual training on
Yeah.
diversity. And
Check.
so, exactly, exactly. And so you and I and others, we have to constantly reframe, and try new entry points and see what resonates because we're trying to read the room.
Mhm.
And so in that role of senior diversity officer at UVU, I felt like we really broke through some walls and barriers by employing this approach to say, look, we're not trying to silence one group by propping up another, right? We're not trying to do, um, uh, we're trying to be both realistic with the historical inequities, and we're trying to recognize that everybody is bringing to this conversation something valuable, right? And that was one key moment. And then I'll just talk about another. Um, I've had in my consulting and speaking work, I've had moments time and time again where people have said to me, I have lost really valuable relationships, like people within my own family I can't even talk to anymore. And you've now introduced a way for me to now re-engage in a way that might even be healthy for me. So there's a concept in the book I talk about in the context lens where I say, we really need to lean into more healthy dissonance. And the idea being that let's be real. As humans, we don't want to be uncomfortable. Like that's just not natural for us.
Yeah.
But if we can look at these moments of discomfort, as you called out, as, oh, this is actually a growth moment for me. This is actually healthy for me.
Yeah.
Then we can reframe our energy coming into that exchange. So, for example, Trina and Kyle, we might disagree on one particular political issue.
Yeah.
But if we can come into that exchange, not ready to battle and not ready to prove the other person wrong, but to really actually come in and say, this is a dissonant moment. My dear friend Trina disagrees with me on this one topic.
Yeah.
But if we talk through this, we can walk away not with consensus, but with understanding. I think it's a really healthy space to be in. So, those are just a couple of examples of some key moments that have helped shape how and why I approached the book the way I did.
I love that. I think that just sometimes our stories. So I'm glad that you were vulnerable and shared your stories. And I did the same thing in my book. Very
Yep.
vulnerable, right?
Yep.
Like just you have to kind of put yourself out there. And I think the more that we can be vulnerable in when we did something wrong and learn from it, and then take that learning and go, okay, this is how it now shifted my mindset.
Mhm.
Because there's so many of those stories where I'm like, oh my gosh, I just did what I talk about I shouldn't do. There was one where I was in an event, and my husband's company had been growing, and we were at this event. They were at an award thing, and I walk in, and the table's full with their employees. I walk up, and I'm like, oh, is this your wife? Assuming she was the wife, right? Not And she's like, no, I'm an employee. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I just did what I'm like always
Yeah.
telling people not to
Yeah.
do. And I think it's a good reminder that we all have biases and it's okay, right? Like
Okay.
it's okay. We all have them. We all do it. It happens, right? But I think the key to your that first lens, the awareness,
Hmm.
right, is so important. Like people will catch themselves like, oh, I just did that. I knew it was wrong rather than just do it and keep moving forward. I think
Yeah.
that's the key shift is the more we can be aware, you can't go back on that. Once you're aware, you're aware.
Oh,
And
and it takes exercise and practice, right? Like for me, and I almost finish every chapter with this phrase, and it's a very in a variation, but it's like, remember, the goal here isn't perfection of understanding every human and all of their different nuance. Like
right.
the goal here is intentionality.
Yeah.
If you can just be more intentional about being more reflective of, oh, somebody said something and I had a visceral response to that. Okay, because I'm actually being intentional about being more reflective, I'm going to pause and actually ask myself, like, why did I have such a visceral reaction to that?
Mhm.
It's coming from somewhere, and their comment came from somewhere.
Yeah.
And if I'm really leaning into humanity, I'm going to want to understand. Now, there are times where the dissonance is not healthy, right? If there's any sort of bullying or abusive situation, I'm not going to say, oh, just understand where they're coming from.
Understand it and
You've got to get out,
put
right?
on a thick
But
skin.
and I will say, let me just pause here on one thing. On the awareness piece, I talk a little bit as well about demonstrating humanity to yourself.
Mhm.
And I think for those who have been in tech moms and those that I've interacted with, those who might be listening to this who are wondering, is it time for me to kind of reframe some things in my life? There's a section I talk about there where I went through my own journey of imposter syndrome, as a graffiti artist who failed out of college and didn't think myself to be college material. Honestly, like I didn't. And oh, I'm just an artist who I have nothing to
So I
say.
hate that word just. Can I just pause? Like,
Please, please.
just get rid of that word just. Because I hear it all the time. I'm just a mom. Oh, I'm like, no, you're not. Like,
Right.
you're a kick-ass mom. Like, what are you talking about? Like it's that reframing. Sorry to interrupt, but I had to
No, no,
get
no. And I've heard you
that
say
was
that. I've heard you
that's
at
a
graduation.
frustration for me.
Oh, sorry.
I said that is a frustration for me. So I just
Oh,
wanted to pause. I didn't mean to interrupt your flow there, but I had to catch it because that's a big one.
no, no, you didn't interrupt the flow at all. You added to it because I've actually heard you say this at graduations for tech moms and just be and say, let's get rid of that mindset. And I've seen, you've talked about seeing the growth in these folks that have been a part of the cohorts. And so I would just, if anybody's listening who's like, who's wondering, has that own self-talk, right? And we talk about shoulder angels and shoulder demons and that war in our head about um, uh, the imposter syndrome or whatever it might be. I just want to say so much of the unpacking what we bring to the table is the lens shift that takes place on the inner lens is also the lens shift on how we perceive our own story in this world and how we perceive our own abilities in this world. So to unpack that is just as healthy for ourselves as it is across relationships. It's healthy for us to start to really dissect the stories that we've been telling ourselves for 20 years without even realizing it. We
Right.
bring narratives and scripts with us that are coded from very deep places from elementary school that we didn't even know we were hanging on
Yeah.
to.
Yeah.
Teasing that we got because of our hairstyle when we were in junior high.
Yeah.
Um, Body image issues that cause us to show up in spaces and not just own the space because we're so concerned about body image and those types of things. And I do believe, and research bears this true, that by and large, right, women are more self-critical in these professional spaces and also can sometimes be hold each other to higher standards of what it means to be professional in
Yeah.
that space. And so these narratives are can be really detrimental to us showing up for others, but also showing up for ourselves with more humanity.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Throughout, we've been doing Tech Moms now for almost 4 years. We have over 500 women that have gone through the program. So
Amazing.
a lot of stories, right?
Amazing.
And this is a key part of success is the internal work.
Yeah.
Um, and one of the things, those stories that I hear are like, well, I was told I wasn't good at math. So I avoided going into careers that would be potentially math focused, which there's so many careers, especially in the tech space, that we opt out of because of those internal messages that told us I'm not good at that.
Right.
And so people are opting out of amazing opportunities within their lives because of those internal messages. And so just stepping back and recognizing what those are. And I think there's another impact there of not entering, but then if you do enter, we also have the stories that keep us from feeling like we belong.
Yeah,
And there is sexism in the workplace. I'm not going to say there's not, right? It is there.
it's definitely there.
But what I found in my career, 30 years in the tech industry, you do face it, you do need to be aware of it, you do need to be able to navigate it. And a lot of it is having a stronger voice and not a thicker skin. A lot of times I just powered through it and like, okay, just ignore it. And so it's another skill set that you have to develop as when you're dealing with these biases, you need to be able to have that skill set. You have to build it to know how to respond.
Yep.
But I think the biggest thing for me, and I don't know why or where I developed it early on, is like, well, I just belong here. I don't care if anybody else feels like I don't belong. I'm just going to show up like I do.
Yeah.
And it helped me power through some really challenging situations. Um, and probably push through a lot more than um I think a lot of people would have just been like, I'm done, right? And a lot of women do. They get into these careers, but then they deal with so much of this, they're just like, I can't, and they opt out and then they're gone. And so that's a lot of the work that we're doing is to be, yes, enter, feel like you do belong there and stay there, and then being able to be strong enough to be able to speak up and work through issues and be able to have these conversations in a healthy way to say that maybe wasn't quite right. Can we talk through that? Right.
Yeah.
It does start from the inside and then move outward. And the more individuals we get doing this, I think that self-awareness of like um knowing that you are battling with doubt, because everybody
Hmm.
feels doubt. The imposter syndrome thing is another one where I really get frustrated because
Yeah.
sometimes it's applied to, well, women do this. I'm like, no, everybody feels doubt.
Everybody. Everybody. Yeah.
There's not anybody on the planet that hasn't second guessed themselves at some point, right? Um,
I,
but I think stepping back and recognizing that. So I really love that you're talking about where do you start, and it's with you.
mhm.
So once you start with that and you start to build that, then moving into that next space of being, let's say you get into these roles and what's the next lens or next step that you should be considering from there?
Yeah, so one of the things I talk about is that the lenses themselves are cyclical. They're not like you have to do this one to move to the next one. I mean,
So
the
they're
inner
kind
lens,
of
context lens,
orchestrating across.
empathy lens, they're always overlapping with each other, right? Because the more context we get about an individual. So let me just give an example.
Sure.
I've been doing interfaith work in Utah County for over a decade, right? Like very specifically across denominations, faith communities. I've been on a national committee to develop curriculum for interreligious, interfaith work. And it's interesting as I talk to people and I just interview them or I ask, hey, tell me what you know about Muslim folks that look at the world through Muslim lenses or self-identify with that particular religious group, or Sikh or Hindu or secular, humanist. And we have these conversations. It's fascinating to me that in the majority of responses, people are like living off of just these like bumper sticker thoughts of stereotypes of a Mormon or a Muslim or whatever it might be, or
Mm.
somebody who's atheist, right? Um, and then when I ask, like, can I just ask, like, how many friendships do you have with people of these various religious groups? And they're like, well, actually, I know somebody, but and so my invitation every time is, hey, would you take some time to actually go and engage more with across these religious identities? Because here's my invitation. I believe that as we develop the context lens, it helps us have the empathy lens. It helps us
Oh,
all of
yeah.
a sudden, the moment we get more context about people and religions and the world around us, we automatically, once we learn their story, we have more empathy. It's hard to listen to someone's story and demonize them, right? It's
Yeah.
it's it's hard to not have some level of empathy once I've heard some aspect of your story. And so those next three lenses of context, empathy, and community, it, the moment we really start to own what we bring to the table, it's a pretty empowering process. And I kind of want to come back to something, if that's okay, Trina, that you mentioned. That's workplace discrimination, and sexism. Is that okay if I just come
Oh,
back to that
absolutely.
from the inner lens? Because it's something that is, I mean, people are like, oh no, we're in 2024, that doesn't happen anymore. We're seeing more women CEOs and we're seeing all this. And I'm like, okay, let's let's continue to read the room and look at the research that says that that's not true, that it's not
Right.
gone away.
It's not.
And and so a couple of thoughts. One is when people have asked me, how do we solve these issues of workplace discrimination, whether it's sexism, racism, or anything?
Right.
Um, I talk about the two responsibilities that take place here. I do think there is, let me start with the individual. I think there's something to you said there where it's like you're not sure where it came from for Trina, but like you just learn to power through certain things and show up and own certain spaces. Now, for some of the listeners out there and some of the women in tech moms and other participants, they may look at you and be like, oh my gosh, I don't have what Trina has, right? Like I don't have that inherent sort of I don't know, grit or resilience or whatever you want to call it. I don't have that. Is
Yeah.
it even developable? Like, is it even something I can develop? And the answer very emphatically is yes.
Absolutely. I'm
And
so glad you came back to that.
it's developable because whenever we opt into an empowering experience like Tech Moms or higher education or a webinar or a podcast, whenever we deliberately take our time to opt into an educational experience, we are learning the language to name our experiences and to take control of our lives.
Yeah.
That is one of the most dignifying experiences we can have. And so when we start to say, how did Trina get to this point? Or how did I get to work with somebody like Astrid Tuminez, right? Who just kind of takes in and walks in and owns a space. Well, she wasn't just born that way, right? Like she developed that. Now, some of it might be hardwired, but she's also had to develop that over the
Develop
years,
it
like
for
you,
sure.
to
Hmm.
say, my education, exposure, engagement has caused me to start to say, you know what? I have something to say. I now have the language to say it. Oh, and now I have enough exposure to realize that everybody else is feeling the same way. I'm
Yeah.
just going to go and show up the way I want to show up. And
Absolutely.
so it almost allows you to let those criticisms bounce off a little bit more the more exposure you have, because you're like, we talk about developing thicker skin, right? So that's the responsibility that I call for on just the individual, whether you're a minoritized or marginalized identity, whatever that might be, right?
Right.
As a person of color, as in different identities.
Hmm.
The second piece to that responsibility and my call to action for organizations, though, and you and I both do this call to action because I've heard you do this,
Yeah.
is yeah, but it's not all individual. We as organizational leaders have a chance to change our environments and to change the very way that we approach whether or not people feel a sense of connection, belonging. They feel humanized in those spaces.
Yeah.
And so when I start, I know I share the four lenses, but where I actually start the whole book in the introduction is my research has suggested that humans yearn for three things across age, across identity, whatever that might be, across country, that humans, we yearn for three things: safety and security, or stability and security, connection, belonging, purpose, and value. Now, when you ask people, what do you yearn for? They come up with a whole bunch of things, right? Whether it's intimacy, wealth, all these different things you yearn for. But really, we can categorize that in these three areas, right? That's safety, stability, connection, belonging, purpose, value. So let me just give an example. As a vice president at a university, at Utah Valley University, as I think through what I want students to experience at the university I get to work at,
Yeah.
I think to myself, I want every student, no matter their background, no matter their orientation, their religious, spiritual affinity, gender identity, whatever that is,
Hmm.
I want them to feel three things when they come to UVU. I want them to feel that they can come and just be themselves in a safe, stabilizing environment. I want them to feel connected and that they belong somewhere, not every, but somewhere on campus, that they feel a connection. And I want them to find that purpose and value by getting that education to empower themselves, right? If I can help them, I believe I'm lifting their humanity. I believe I'm actually adding to the humanity of this community because I've now deliberately looked and been sensitive at creating moments and spaces and experiences and sensitivities that say to every student, I see you, I hear you, and I value you, and we're going to show up differently for you. So I'll stop there, but any thoughts about those two responsibilities?
Yeah, and I think this ties in a lot of times when I do corporate consulting in this space, businesses are built to drive revenue, right? It's growth and profitability, right?
Yep.
So let's talk about those two things. And even from an education space, it's
Yeah.
driven off students, right? Coming to the university.
Yep.
And what better way to grow your business than to attract great talent
Hmm.
and open mindsets? And there's been a ton of research on the benefits of having varied perspectives to drive innovation and growth, right? So
Absolutely.
it does drive you do have to consider this because like even at UVU, and I know, as part of the foundation board and these discussions of like the students that we're attracting and pulling in, and one of the biggest things is they're feeling like they belong, and that feeling at UVU is very real. Like you feel it. And my own son came to me with that same experience. So my son is gay, and he felt like that was the university where he knew he could go and felt like he belonged without any kind of backlash or not feeling like he could be himself and just show up as he is, right? Like that was such a relief for me to have him feel that and communicate that and going, yeah, I love going to school here because I know I can just be myself.
Yeah.
Where he felt like if he went to another institution, he wouldn't be accepted or felt like he belonged and his education would have been limited, right?
Sure.
Because he
Sure.
couldn't quite just move through and work the way he needed to. And I think organizations are recognizing this, right? Like they're doing the work. And I don't know if it's really translated into how much that's going to help drive their business sometimes though. And
Right.
understanding it's going to help with retention. I mean, that's a huge cost from a profitability standpoint if you're losing individuals and not, because they're not feeling like they can show up as themselves. And so I
Well,
think
yeah.
there's a business mindset here that can be applied to this work. It's not just
Even if
this is a nice thing to do.
look, you're tracking exactly. Even if, and so when I've just like you said in corporate consultations, when I've gone to educational institutions, it's very different than going to a corporate consultation, right? And I will tell you, let me put on just a strictly business hat, and I'm not like a business, I'm not as savvy, I haven't owned a business or anything like that, but let me put on a business hat. Cisco does a report every decade on workplace satisfaction and productivity. Okay. So they did it in 2010, 2020. And again, 2020, I think COVID enlightened everybody on what humans are desiring from workplace satisfaction.
Mhm.
The research is irrefutable that when people feel like they have a connection to at least one or more, at least one colleague at their place of that they're more productive. If somebody feels like their voice is heard and valued, they're more productive.
Yeah.
If people feel a sense of connection to the vision and mission of the organization, they're going to put in more work and more hours without it feeling like burnout.
Yeah.
Again, these Cisco reports are awesome because they track loneliness, workplace loneliness. They
Mhm.
track workplace satisfaction, where people talk about, you know, lunch breaks and all the little things that matter when it comes to, wait a minute, if I can create an environment where people actually look forward to coming to work, imagine the productivity and creativity they're bringing to that environment.
Yeah.
If I'm just harping on efficiencies and output and bottom line and revenue, I am going to have high turnover. I'm going to have disgruntled employees. People are going to do slow quitting on me. They're
Mhm.
going to pretend they're at their desk, but they're not going to be doing work.
Mhm.
They're not bringing their best creative thoughts. They're not bringing energy. Oh, and by the way, let's not forget that energy begets energy.
Yeah.
When we are working in teams that are dynamic and creative and energetic, we feed off that,
Yeah.
and the clients and the customers feed off that. And the inverse is true, or I should say that the flip side of that is true.
Yeah.
If you and I both have engaged with companies where you're like, oh my gosh, I am so no wonder they're having issues.
Yeah.
Like from the very top,
Very,
it's so
the minute you enter
cynical.
the door, you can almost feel it sometimes.
Oh, you can feel
Right?
that energy. So yeah, amen to what you just said.
Yeah. So it was really interesting. This is just happened this morning. So I've been reading, I do a lot of work in tech, right? And
Yeah.
have been doing a lot of work in the AI space and AI consulting and AI training, right? Like AI is like the
Yep.
world right now.
Yep.
So we're going to bring it up, okay?
Let's
Because
bring
I
it up.
find it interesting um, that there's such a focus on the tech and this AI space. And I've been reading this book by Kai-Fu Lee called AI Superpowers. I don't know if you've heard about it, but
I
it's
haven't, but I'm gonna write it down now.
yeah, it's about, and there's another one that's on the backlog. I haven't read it yet on co-intelligence and this partnership of technology and humanity and how those start to come together. And I think this work on the humanity side is so important, and your book is so relevant right now because we can't just be focused on the tech and the tech solving everything, and how does it coexist with the humanity side. And this morning my husband and I were, sometimes we'll watch some podcasts in the morning or some interviews, and he brought up Kai-Fu Lee because he knew I was reading this book. And
Yeah.
it was interesting because he's talking about all this AI and the tech and how it's growing and will impact our business and, all of these different things. But at the very end, you know how he ended it? He said, what's going to be the most important now is the importance for empathy and leadership and that human side of it. Because what's going to happen is AI is not going to replace humanity.
Right.
It's a different intelligence. It's not the same, right? And so he's like, I had to shift my idea that AI was going to, show us how the human, brain works. It's different. It's a different type of application. It's an enhancement, right? But it allows us, and
Yeah.
where we really need to focus on is the empathy and humanity side of it. And so I think that, as you're talking about empathy and maybe expand a little bit more
Sure.
on empathy and leadership and why that's so important, and what you're talking about in the book on the importance of that empathy side.
Yeah. I'll answer your question, but now I have a whole flood of ideas on what you just said based on the AI connection. So for another day. Yeah, on the empathy lens, that those three chapters, because there's three chapters per lens, the three chapters that cover the empathy lens is really all about, for me, it comes back to human communication and human reading other humans. It's the emotional intelligence
Mhm.
of reading the room, of understanding everything from tone and body language and intent. It goes back to, I used to be a professor of intercultural communication, so it stems from my own research on cross-cultural communication and human understanding.
Mhm.
So some of the concepts that I really lean into within that framework and invite the readers to consider how we can get better at this are starting from a place of cultural humility. I think when it comes to engagement with difference, we again, let me go back to, we automatically assume that every time we engage with some different opposing view or some different view of the world, that we now have to devolve into a debate, and that somebody has to win and
Yeah.
somebody has to lose.
Isn't
And with
that
that
the
mentality,
current state of society right now?
oh, and political years just exacerbate that, right?
Yeah.
Because we are in the debate season. So once we enter a space on human interaction and we start from a framework that any different opinion is ripe for debate, we've already lost. Like we've already lost when it comes to lifting humanity. So the question is, can we immediately reframe our energy in this notion of, I'm going to practice cultural humility. I'm going to practice this idea that I actually believe I can learn from somebody else. I actually believe that somebody else can add value by shifting my lenses, not necessarily to the point where they have completely reframed my convictions or my belief system, but that they perhaps have added where I can shift here or there, right? I can ever evolve with my lenses.
Yeah.
So cultural humility, genuine inquiry. You and I both know that when people ask you, Trina, Kyle, how do you address, blatant racism, or how do you address how do you call people out in a meeting when somebody says something that's microaggressive, or somebody says something that you're like, wait, did everybody else just hear that? You don't ignore it, but you also have to be careful at the moment you start to shut people down, they shut down, and then everybody else shuts down. So how do you address that? In most cases, I've just said, I just ask more questions,
Yeah.
because genuine inquiry and genuine curiosity allow me to both, and genuine is key here, allow me to understand where they're coming from, but it also doesn't put the onus on me to correct them.
Right.
By asking them follow-up questions, they have to be signaled like, maybe what I said didn't land in the way that I
Yeah.
intended
Oh,
it. Let me
yeah.
reframe them, right? And
Yeah.
so the empathy piece for me is, are these all these different ways to start to actually change how we're approaching these human interactions, the one-to-one, one to, a few. I talk about humanizing communication, why names, why labels, why identity markers matter. And I
Mhm.
talk about the power and the history of what it means to actually name something, or to name an experience. My kids have Hawaiian first names and Navajo middle names. Okay. They come from a very personal place. I don't expect everybody to have the same origin with their personal name as my kids might have from their Hawaiian meaning and those types of things. But let's go away from just our own names for a second. Let's go to what it has meant to have those that have historically had power, those who have historically been able to document things, to literally claim stake on naming things, right?
Yeah.
What it means to name an experience. And so what I argue is, words matter so much, because what it signals is I should be allowed to name my own experience, and I should be allowed to dictate how I would like to be referred to,
Right.
right? And
Right.
so when we talk about, oh, Kyle, are we getting too politically correct with pronouns, and are we getting too
Yeah.
politically correct with all these things? I'm like, well, again, you can have your view, but if the goal is to lift humanity, if the goal is to recognize and dignify their human experience,
Yeah.
why wouldn't I at least try to
Yeah.
call them by how they would be preferred to be called? And
Yeah.
so to me, then, when we talk about, are we getting too politically correct? I said, it's amazing to me. I get to learn new words all the time. And
Yeah.
then in Utah, sometimes I have to remind people there are entire communities, entire religious communities that care about how they're called and how they're named, right? Like they
Right.
want to be
Yeah.
labeled in very specific ways. Why would it be any different for an individual to say, you know what? This
That's
is how I
important to me.
self-identify, and it's
Yeah.
important to me. So
Yeah.
those are just some of the concepts in the empathy lens.
Yeah. It's interesting. The pronouns thing, um, didn't real I, for me, always recognizing and going, okay, I acknowledge that. But it was really interesting. I started reading books differently,
Mm.
especially leadership books, which are usually written in male,
Yep,
right?
yep,
Okay.
yep,
So, and I didn't realize, like, for my whole life, that I've been excluding myself, that that book wasn't talking to me.
yep.
And I was in Maui and went to we like to go to little bookstores, right? And I found James Allen's As a Man Thinketh.
Yes.
And I
Yep.
found this cute little book, and I bought it because I love that book. It's great. And I was sitting on my deck, back at the room, and kind of looking out over the ocean. And I was like, I'm gonna read this book. And I remember thinking, I'm gonna just switch it to female. And I
Yeah.
read the book aloud that night, and I switched it all, and I'm like, oh my gosh, it finally internalized for me. It was the first time that I'd read a book like that, where I'm like, oh, now it's talking to me, not about someone else.
Mhm.
That it became so much more real. And I hadn't realized, and this is only a few years ago,
Yeah. Yeah.
that it just dawned on me, like, how much pronouns matter,
Yep.
right? Like when you're writing a book, if you're writing and you're talking about he, right, and instead of she, how much we're excluding half the population sometimes.
Yep. Yep.
And so I actually now, as I read books,
Yeah. Yeah.
and I reread, and I have to go back and reread it for me so I can internalize it.
But
And it's powerful. Like I
it's
didn't realize how much that really mattered.
and it's so subtle, but then the moment you know it to look for it, it's
Yeah, that
everywhere, right?
awareness. Yeah, like
And those, especially in business leadership books, like you called out, I'll be reading everything from, I mean, everything. And again, I don't call out these titles as if I'm calling out anybody in particular, but some of the most prominent business books that everybody reads, right? Good to Great and Seven Habits and all these different things. You go back and you're like, oh, okay. Whenever they reference a case study, whenever they talk about leadership, whenever they talk about
Mhm.
it's the ubiquitous he
Mhm.
representing all leaders. And it's funny you say that because when I was writing my book and I would talk about experiences, right? And I say, when I interact with a student at Utah Valley University, I want to make sure that she is experiencing things in a certain way. And it's funny because as some of my test readers were like, well, in this particular, like, are you talking about somebody in particular? And I said, well, why do you ask that? And they're like, well, you said she. And I'm like, but if I said he, you would have even thought about that.
Yeah.
Like, it would have
Yeah.
been just a normalcy for you. And so back and forth in the book, I actually kept going back and forth and utilizing he, she, they across different references of an example. But yeah, you and I, you can't unsee it anymore.
Yeah. I see every book like The Woman in the Arena, right?
Yeah.
I
Yes.
write that
Yes.
whole thing at the end of my book,
Yep.
and it just because I really want to make sure that and when I wrote, this was something like it's interesting because you had this same thought as you're writing a book, you have to be thinking about who you're writing to,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And I wanted as you start writing, you're always like, I want to write to everyone. This is going to help everyone, right? Which it makes it harder to
Uh-huh.
write. And
Uh-huh.
so I had to be very intentional as I wrote, going, okay, who am I really going to target? And I'm like, okay, I'm predominantly female, so I'm going to write to my women. So I changed a lot of those quotes and put
Yeah.
them in
Yeah.
female form. But what was interesting, this is what's really cool, is that I've had a lot of executives, male executives, reach out and be like, this is the first I've started to realize this. And then the impact that they had, right? Of being able to read that and then be aware of it. And once you start speaking up and you're realizing it and you're having these conversations, which I'm so glad we're having this conversation, because then, like I said, we're creating awareness. And then once you're aware, you're like, oh, okay, you're going to start seeing it,
Yeah.
right? You start seeing it in your day to day, and you start making shifts, just subtle, and it's not anything major. It's just like, oh, well, maybe we change that, or maybe we like
Yeah,
reduce
exactly.
this here. It's the little subtle shifts add up very quickly.
And it's learnable. Like it's not that you and I were born with all these
Yeah.
sensitivities, right? We have you and I have put in the work to learn some of these sensitivities, and we're still evolving, and we're still
Oh,
gonna
absolutely.
stumble.
I've
And
learned.
so to anybody out there that's like, oh, I haven't gotten my degree or I haven't done this. It's like, hey, all of this stuff is learnable the more exposure we have and the more we read and the more we engage with difference. And that for me is, if I know something is learnable, I'm much more excited to engage with it because then I'm like, oh, it's not for those who are, it's not the born with it or not born with it,
Yeah,
right?
you don't have to be have arrived. I
Yeah.
think this is one other key thing that I think is applicable of the perfection trap of
Mhm.
um before I do anything, I have to have it all figured out, right? I have to have learned it all. And this is something that I coach to a lot with our students, of like, no, just get in and start doing it.
Yeah.
Like you were saying, just start going to different religious sects, because start getting involved with different communities. Just put yourself out there. You never know what type of relationships or who you're going to grow from. I do a lot of work with Silicon Slopes right now, and we're running these executive programs. And the way they kick off the program is they say, don't walk into the room and look around to go, who's going to help me the most?
Yeah.
Right? Okay, that person looks like they're going to help me the most. You're going to be limiting yourself if you do that. Walk into the room and just be open, and build relationships with everyone,
Yeah.
because you never know who
Yeah.
it is that you're really going to get help from. You can't decide that by looking at somebody,
Agreed.
right? And it's really powerful, because you just never know what somebody's network might be, or who's in their network, or and that power of networks is really huge. And when you broaden your network from where you've been to like a broader, it's amazing how much it expands your opportunities across the board. And
I love that. I
long
love that.
sweet. that's the number one thing that really our organization focuses on is that networking,
Yeah.
and expanding your networks is extremely powerful, right?
Well, and let me add one more element to that that shows up in the empathy lens as well. And I talk a lot about reciprocity. I talk about how sometimes when we think about, let's just talk, when we think about charitable organizations, right? We think about certain charities that are out there all around the world. I'm not poo-pooing charity. Like I love charitable work. I love charities. I love the word charity, right? But I think sometimes it's this idea that those who have are going to give to those who don't have, and it's a one-directional exchange.
Yeah.
And it's this, it's oh, I'm going to lift the poor, unfortunate souls. And again, I donated? Yes. Do I love that? Yes. But there's something lost in if we don't have a relationship with it, we've lost an opportunity for humanity. There
Yeah.
might have been charity there, but there might have not have been the actual empowerment. So, for example, and you know this very well because of your involvement with UVU, we want so badly that if somebody donates to a scholarship, they don't just donate and then walk away, right?
Yeah.
And say, "Oh, I've helped some poor unfortunate soul." We
Yeah.
want to connect them with the very student that has benefited from them. Oh, I want to be anonymous, and we actually say, actually, can we introduce you to the student? Because there's humanity in that relationship. All of a sudden, the student gives something back to the donor to say, here's how I've grown, here's how I'm going to pay it forward, and so many times donors have said, I've received so much more from that engagement than I ever
Absolutely.
gave financially. So
Yeah.
what's interesting in this idea of perfectionism or networking even, and if those that are in tech moms, they go to an event, a networking event, don't forget that as much as you're trying to expand your network, like you're also expanding your impact and influence. You are there to say, I'm going to lift people's humanity because I have something to offer too.
Yeah.
They don't even know that I could be a part of their network, right?
Yeah.
And there's something that just psychologically flips your energy. If I go into a space and I automatically assume, oh shoot, I have to network so that I can grow my business or I can grow my book sales or I can grow whatever, um, then I'm missing out on actually humanizing the fact that they may have needs as well, and
Mhm.
I have something to offer. And that reciprocity humanizes both of us.
I love that. And it's such a great way to kind of wrap things up here because I think understanding that we all have something to give,
Mhm.
we all have something to learn,
Yeah.
right? And learn from others individuals, and taking that approach of just both the internal and external, bringing those two sides together is
Yeah.
extremely powerful in that humanity side of it. I love the shift to just thinking about humanity, right? And getting out of this like terminology war, I guess is what I would say, this emotional shutdown that we've had. I
Yeah.
think it's time to open up to our humanity. I think there's a lot of things driving that right now.
Mhm.
And people are seeking it. See, people want it, right? It's not oh the checkbox. I'm glad we're stepping out of that. I'm ready to put that behind us. I'm ready to put that whole thing behind us and just say, let's just open up to our humanity and experiences, and be open to whatever I can learn from whoever I can learn it from.
Yeah. Yeah. Agreed.
I
Agreed,
love
man.
it. So let me just ask, next, what's next?
Yeah.
So when does your book come out? Where can we get it? What's
Sure.
be the next steps here?
Sure. First of all, as I mentioned, I love connecting with people. So anybody listening, please connect with me on LinkedIn, Kyle Reyes. You can find me as an administrator at Utah Valley University and an author. But connect with me on Instagram and on LinkedIn. And you'll get updates on the book launch. So right now, as we have it going with the publisher, we will have it available on Amazon starting in mid-August, and then it'll start to ship early September. And the other thing there is if even if you just want to explore, if you're from an individual level, you just want to engage in a conversation, or if you are a leader of an organization and you're just wondering, how can we talk about these things in a different way? First reach out to Trina, and then Trina will reach out to me. But yeah, I mean, both of us stand ready to engage these conversations in a way that's more healing. The subtitle of my book is, Lenses of Humanity: How Reflection, Connection, and Empathy Can Heal Our World. I think our is in continual need of healing, and what I want to do is, continue the conversation and grow from this. Somebody asked me, "Well, what's after the book and the book launch?" And I'm like, "Oh my gosh, let me just get to the book. Let
Yeah,
me just get to the book
exactly.
launch."
You're in the, it's just
But but
out
but I'm sure this has already happened with you because I think you've said this. Once you've tasted that and once you've put something out there and you've engaged in a broader public discourse conversation, you're like, okay, what else am I going to write? And so I've started thinking about humanity-based leadership, humanity-based, what does humanity-based parenting look like, and some of those things. And again, I don't pretend to know all the answers, but they're intriguing questions for me on where this goes. And I'm just looking forward to like the messy journey along the way.
there. I love it. And messy is fine and good. It's all organizing chaos. That's what I call it.
Yep.
We're moving through it, but I'm so excited to be able to get a copy here soon and to be able to digest everything that we've talked about in a deeper level. There's a few things that I've called out that I love, like the safety to connection to purpose. Love that. I think it's an amazing framework. I think there's a lot everybody's going to learn from this. So thank you so much for being with us today. Can't wait
Pleasure. Thank you.
for. Thank you, Kyle.
Thanks, Trina.